everybody. It's Stephanie Ruper. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Naked Humanity podcast. Today is episode number 35, and I have on Professor Ursula Goodenough, who's a biologist and a specialist on the ways in which religion and science can correlate. So today's episode is fantastic. I'm so happy to bring on Professor Ursula Goodenough, who is one of my literally lifelong idols. A few quick notes. You may notice, if you're tuning in, if you're listening, that that this recording, maybe the audio is a little bit off. If you're watching, you may have noticed that I do not have my normal digs. I am currently in the process of moving, and we had some technical difficulties, and so I am re-recording this introduction to our episode with Professor Goodenough. The episode itself will be in standard format, just this intro is a little bit off, and also due to these technical difficulties, I lost episode number 35X, and it will not be recovered, so we will have to live without it. It was an episode about emergence. Now, emergence is a property of the universe that we talk about a lot in philosophy, and it basically describes the ways in which increasing levels of complexity emerge from less complex, right? So, for example, we often talk about how the laws of chemistry are not quote unquote reducible to physics, but they are coherent with physics and arise out of physics, right? And you can say the same thing, for example, about an ecosystem, right? It's not necessarily a physical law that predators and prey have certain kinds of interactions, but it is a law that we find happening once you get to the level of complexity of ecosystems. Now, people relate to this in a somewhat spiritual fashion, often because the spiritual is often thought of as emerging from the emotional or the mental or what have you. And this is actually something that Professor Goodenough is very skilled at explicating. So I would recommend Googling Ursula Goodenough and emergence, or just emergence itself, emergence in spirituality, emergence in religion, if you're interested in how people sort of take this idea of emergence to embed their spirituality in the natural world. And if you want, you can send me questions about it, and maybe I'll do a future podcast episode about it. So that's that for that episode. Today's episode with Professor Goodenough is just really remarkable. It has been such an honor, again, to speak with one of my role models and somebody who has been immensely influential in what we call the field of religious naturalism. Now, the show, I have had a few religious naturalists, card-carrying religious naturalists on the show already. Don Crosby is a brilliant philosopher, religious naturalist thinker. I had him on for episodes 22 and 23 about nihilism and the modern world, and how religious naturalism could be a way to cope with or change your nihilistic feelings, that is, your feelings of meaninglessness. I also had on Michael Hogue, who is a prominent critic, or not critic, but commentator within the religious naturalism space. And now I'm having on Ursula Goodenough, and I will have on some more. In today's episode, we talk a lot about her experiences with biology, how she has gone to church and stopped going to church, and her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, which really changed the game in terms of how we think about nature and relating to it on a spiritual level. We have all these ideas that spirituality has to look a particular way, but when you look into a scientific interpretation of nature, and especially in this brilliant way that Professor Goodenough does, then you can sort of see how you can retain religious feelings, you can have spirituality, even without very normal trappings of spirituality. So do listen in and enjoy this episode. It's wonderful, and she's a wonderful, inspiring figure and woman. I'll read you a little bit about her. Ursula Goodenough, says her bio, is one of the best-known voices in religious naturalism. This is true, I can attest. She is author of the best-selling book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, which, in examining cosmology, evolution, cell biology, and aspects of life, celebrates the mystery and wonder of being alive, and suggests that religious naturalism can serve as the basis for planetary ethics that draw from both science and religion. Professor Goodenough is a professor of biology at Washington University. She has discussed religious naturalism in essays, college classes, and parts of blogs, television series, and radio productions. She participated in conversations with the Dalai Lama, a rare honor, sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. Her work has been discussed in Religious Naturalism Today by Jerome Stone and The Promise of Religious Naturalism by Michael Hogue, who I had on the podcast. And these are both also fantastic books, and her book is fantastic. So, to reiterate, please enjoy. It's a great episode. Thank you so much for your patience. I will talk to you next week. Here is Professor Goodenough. Okay, hi. Welcome, Ursula.
Welcome. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. So I recently, about 10 or 15 episodes ago, I had on Mike Hogue, who was a really delightful guest. And he told me that you were teaching a course on religious naturalism recently. That recently concluded, right?
It did, yes.
Yeah. How was that? How did that go?
It was the first week of April. It was wonderful. There was lots of, class was full. It was intensive. 9 to 5, 5 days. And Mike and I did a lot, and then we had a bunch of people zooming in to do their things, and lots of roundtable discussions among the seminarians and general conversation. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I have been told that you're very proactive I know this also because I've read dozens of articles by you, but I have. I don't know if I think I told you this, that there is actually a chapter on you in my dissertation, and so I've actually
I didn't notice. Cool.
I was finishing editing the chapter today.
Oh, okay. Please send it to me. I'd love to read it.
That makes me the most nervous in the world because, of course, of all the people who could read it and say, wow, this is totally inaccurate, right? It's obviously you.
Well, but why not make it accurate? And my ideas about what's inaccurate may not be correct.
Yeah, the chapter is basically on, I construct an idea of salvation. And so the chapter is basically on what I call the soteriological potential of science in the sacred depths of nature, your book.
So what does soteriology mean?
Sorry, you spend so much time with scholars of religion. It means like saving, right?
Saving. Okay. That's
salvation.
But I want to be sure. Okay.
Yeah. Which is delightful. Okay, so I'm totally getting ahead of myself here. I think that you have a unique voice and experience and all of these sorts of things, and so I'm very excited to share your views with my audience. And so maybe we could just get started with you telling us a little bit about what the idea of religious naturalism means to you.
Okay, so first of all, I tried very hard not to use the naturalism, although I did use it in my book. But since then, I have come to understand that people in general are kind of, I think correctly, leery of isms. It suggests dogma and inflexibility and know-it-allness, and the whole idea of what I'm now calling a religious naturalist orientation, where naturalist is an adjective, is that it is an orientation. It is therefore ultimately works with an individual person, may also come to be an orientation that a group develops and then agrees to share, but that the idea that there is such a thing as religious naturalism has come to just not work for me at all. So I may go ahead and use it as we talk, just because it's easier than the religious naturalist orientation. But I think that's a very important feature of it, is that nature just is. Nature presents herself to us in all of her complexity and wonder, and then a religious naturalist responds to those understandings of nature religiously, and those responses can vary from person to person, depending on what traditional religions they may have been raised in, their own temperament, what they're seeking in their religious life, all sorts of things. And I regard this diversity of orientations to be thrilling rather than a mess, because there is it's not like it's completely all over the place. What's grounding it is everybody's story and how nature works. And so there's the one rule, we can talk about a rule, is you don't get to cherry pick. You don't get to say, well, I don't like this about nature, so I'm going to pretend it's not there. So since there are rules, the diversity, I think, is exciting.
Mm. Yeah, so I think your position, I really appreciate this, and I think you would understand the diversity particularly well because you choose. You're still attending church? Is that correct?
Well, there was a
time.
Well, yeah. You mentioned that in your email. When I wrote the book, I was participating in a church. It was motivated initially because this was prior to any of the RN work that I'm doing, by the fact that I'm a singer. And I walked into this church and discovered there was an excellent choir director wwho was choosing music that I love to sing. And so I joined the choir. But when you join the choir, you listen to every sermon. There you are, you go to every service. And so I came to understand what was going on there. What happened in that particular case was that particular music director moved to another city. His replacement chose music that I was less interested in, so I stopped going. So, and recently I've moved from St. Louis to Martha's Vineyard, where I retired 2 years ago, and I have joined the UU Church, where I also sing in the choir. But the UU is obviously, because it doesn't really have any grounding tenets or anything, it's more conducive to RN. So I've given some sermons and stuff like that.
That's really interesting. I had no idea. I used to, before I moved to England, attend UU services all the time. I think it's a fantastic community, and I find it not altogether surprising that you have ended up there. For the people listening, the UU community tends to be a more naturalistic place, or one that appreciates diversity, but is sort of people collect around basic guiding principles having to do with a religious search for meaning. So that's very interesting to me. Did you find that there was dissonance in your experience with nature, your orientation to nature, and the participating in a Christian liturgy, or was that it's because you, at least in the book, presented it as something that was pretty seamless?
Oh, well, I mean, the traditional religions are part of nature.
That is a good way to put it.
It's part of nature. And so considering them and mining them for their wisdom, as well as noticing aspects of their understandings that don't resonate, and therefore you don't pull them into your own orientation, I think is a wonderful challenge. And when I was writing Sacred Depths, I very much was looking not only, of course, to the Christian writings and understandings, but also those of other faith traditions and indigenous traditions and so on, and as well as poetry and art and everything. So all of the stuff that we humans have come up with in our cultures are part of nature.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. I'm going to have to update the chapter in my dissertation, which is good. It's for the better. Okay, so something that I found particularly interesting was your elaboration of this idea that science can be disenchanting or cause despair or anxiety, at least on first encounter. And then when you delve into it or you interpret it, and especially the way that you do in your book and in your works, then it can become a way to know nature in a way that is actually spiritually enlivening. But I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about perhaps your experience or perspective on the sort of negative encounter that we can have with science, because I think a lot of people do feel resistance to science for this reason.
Okay, so you used science in two different ways in what you just said. Mm-hmm. One is science as a practice, and the other is what science learns as a consequence of its practice.
Right.
And that, I won't use the pejorative of confusion, but I'll say that misunderstanding or that ambiguity has caused, I think, a lot of confusion generally in our times. So science is a practice. It's a way of asking questions. It's the usual thing that everybody sort of gets one way or the other during school, the hypothesis and testing the hypothesis and reproducibility and all these boring things. But it's not limited to people with degrees in science. So if you go out and try to start your car and it doesn't start, you develop a hypothesis. Oh, maybe I'm out of gas. And so then there's a test of that hypothesis. You look at your gas gauge and see, oh, maybe my battery is burned out. So you turn on the lights and see if the lights go on. So, I mean, we do science all the time. Kids do science all the time. You watch them and they're trying to figure something out and they test it. Scientists who get paid to do this can be asking questions of stars, of the earth, of people, social scientists, cultural historians, and cultural analysts. They're all doing science. They're all asking questions and testing them and putting them out there, and then people agree or disagree and find out other things. The understanding that comes from that inquiry depends on how good your data is. So sometimes when you get a new equipment or you discover that your gas gauge is busted and you really are out of gas, but using your gas gauge wasn't a good idea. You should have opened up the tank in your car and noticed that it was empty. So there's lots of ways that scientific understandings deepen, and sometimes they're wrong, but they're usually wrong either because the data is bad for one reason or another. So then the second piece is what science has come up with. And so the science that we have today has come up with a very deep understanding of the natural world, a more tentative understanding of the human, actually. I think we understand more about the natural world than we do about human beings at this point. But all of these understandings are what I would call nature. As I said earlier, including human beings and their cultures. And so those understandings can deepen and will deepen, but there's lots of stuff that we know about the natural world that I feel I could predict my right arm are not going to go away. I mean, DNA is not going to be found to have no relevance to how life works. We're stuck with DNA. It's part of the story. Stars are not going to go away as the generators of the heavy elements in the universe. That's where they're made. And so the religious naturalist then takes these understandings and works with them religiously. And some of the understandings then can be ones that a particular religious naturalist doesn't feel comfortable with. Some people, and I have in the reflection to my first chapter in Sacred Depths, get freaked out about all of how big the universe is and how the whole thing seems to be pointless and how we're this tiny little speck and all of that, and would prefer understandings that put human in the center of everything. So those are challenges. But I don't think those are challenges that we could say have to do with science. I think they are challenges that have to do what science has let us know about.
Right. So science, if we use it as a term for what we have been able
what
to
we found,
right? What we have found, what we can't,
which I think is confusing. But we can go ahead and do it if you want to.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's the reason that I often do so is because I think in our contemporary culture, that is the thing about the act or the phenomena or the monolith of science that people feel resistant to, or that they will pit against religion, right? Or it's one of the ways in which they'll pit it against religion, and so we end up with these like two very supposedly bifurcated ways of looking at things. Well, of course they don't have to be, but we end up with that distinction, I think in large part because, it comes from the methods, which you referenced, of course.
It's just really unfortunate but anyway, there we are. So, okay, at least you and I understand each other, and maybe some of your listeners will.
Yes, I think they will.
Will be helped by this distinction, because religion isn't a way of investigation. I mean, religion formally is what you come up with at the end of the day in terms of what your belief system is, and you can come up with that using all sorts of modes of inquiry. You can read religious texts, you can look at nature, you can look into your own experiences, you can talk to your friends, lots of ways to come up with what you would call your religion.
I'm putting more thought into what you said, into the urgency with which you think these two categories of types of science should be separated, and I'm starting to think you're very right. And we need new language. We could just say nature, right? But people,
that's what I try to do.
I think people would. It wouldn't be immediate to people if you said nature that you meant a scientific understanding of nature, because we do have this antiquated kind of dichotomy about a scientific understanding of nature, and I don't know what the other alternative.
Well, so one could say I like to walk in the woods because I'm part of nature, and in those situations, you have two options. You can just think about how beautiful it is and how happy you are to be there and stuff like that. Or you can go into, gee, those trees are photosynthesizing, and gee, those trees have genes that are like my genes, and gee, what's the adaptive advantage of that flower being that shape? So you can ask scientific questions of nature if that's what floats your boat. I do that all the time when I'm out in nature because that's
what floats your boat.
But it's not necessary to enjoy nature to have those questions. And very often I will go out in nature and everything that I see is so gorgeous that I don't go there. So it's also our context and our habitat, and we can just enjoy being in it as a fellow creature.
Yeah. So in this understanding of nature that you have gleaned from scientific method,
scientific inquiry.
Scientific inquiry. Okay. So something that I think is really important, and which I think you have done in a pretty unique and important way, is to sort of look at the kinds of functions that religion tends to perform for us, or the kinds of answers that it tends to provide, right? And to see if we can find alternatives in nature that are also spiritually or emotionally satisfying, or however we want to think of it. And so I'm wondering if you would be willing to talk about maybe a couple of facts or things you know about the world and how they are, in a sense, do provide some kind of meaning, something like emergence or the connectivity of life that we know through studies of biodiversity. I can pick one if you want. I know them all by heart.
Well, yeah, go ahead and pick one.
Okay, let's start with the concept of emergence, because I think you can apply that to physics and chemistry and life and consciousness, right? It's a very powerful concept.
Some people apply it to physics, but I think that's pushing it. I mean, physics just is running along using its rules, and it's not like emergence breaks any rules. It's just that it describes events that generate something else than what was there before it occurred. So the basic idea is that the T-shirt slogan is something else from nothing but. And so the nothing but, and how you get the something else from nothing but is that the nothing buts in a given context form relationships with one another. And these relationships usually, at the end of the day, take the form of molecular shapes, molecular shapes. So in Deaconese, that Terry Deacon would say this is morphodynamics, but we don't need to go to all of that stuff. It's just that proteins form shapes that allow them to catalyze a chemical reaction, and those particular shapes were not there in the individual atoms or amino acids or whatever of the protein. They form as a consequence of the protein's fold. But once they have formed, then what emerges is the capacity to catalyze. And the capacity for catalyzing is something else from all the other things that we can say about the protein, all of which are true. But the capacity to catalyze is something that an organism would use to make its way in the world. And so this emergence, the ability of organisms to generate shapes that generate emergent properties and functions, is sort of the big new deal that living organisms have come up with. And what living organisms have come up with writ large is that they have aims, they have a purpose. So some people get disturbed by the idea that the universe doesn't have a purpose, and whether it does or not, I don't care, because I don't know, and I'm sure anybody else would know unless we get data to that effect. But what is perfectly clear is that this planet is just shimmering with purpose. Every single critter on the planet has a very, very, very deep aim, which is to keep itself alive, keep itself going, find resources, protect itself from predators and so on. And so there's just gazillions of these wonderful creatures here, and for hundreds of millions of years, billions of years, purposefully doing their thing. And I think that that's going back to the original question that you wanted to do in this segment, that's a really important religious concept, to realize that life on Earth is certainly unique in terms of all other places in the universe that we know about. This is not to say that someday there won't be life discovered somewhere else, but if it is discovered somewhere else, be it some optical device that we figure out how to use and go there or something, that life will be so far from us, so distant, that the idea that we'll ever actually hang out together is pretty remote. So for me, the idea that the Earth is the unique and only home of purpose in the universe just blows it up to be incredibly important. that we take care of the place.
Mm. Yeah, I personally find it was so astonishing to me how counterintuitive that idea was, coming from the presumption that purpose had to come from a God for me. But I now do find the purposefulness, of life, and also the things that go along with purpose, like evaluation, value, and aesthetics, even. To be, it's quite compelling, and it's radically, I think, underestimated. In our nihilistic world. Okay, so that's emergence. What about? Can we talk about death and the sort of the impacts that learning about multicellularity may have? one might learn about.
Okay.
How to approach death.
So we talked about aims and about how each creature tries to keep itself together. When a creature, to use a word that messes with some people's minds, but all living beings are basically trying to counter entropy, trying to counter the tendency of anything in the universe to fall apart and not be ordered. And so they're trying to keep it ordered. They're trying to keep their metabolism going. They're trying to keep their motility going. They're trying to keep their life going. And when that effort eventually falls apart, they die. And that, for a single-celled organism, that could happen just by not having enough to eat, or having the wrong pH in their environment, or too hot or whatever, or being killed or eaten by some other organism. So there are lots of ways for single-celled organisms to die. But if they don't die, what they instead do is they divide into two daughter organisms, and each of those daughter organisms then sets out to keep itself going. And so there is no obligate death in the structure of their life cycles, even though death can and does happen routinely. It doesn't have to happen. And what's different about that and the multicellular organism is that the multicellular organism, having lots of different kinds of cells, where this has arisen, and it's risen, multicellularity has arisen independently in land plants and animals. So those are two that we know about. So we can just use those two kinds of multicellularity. Multicellular organisms, their embryology is really different. It clearly evolved independently. It wasn't, one didn't give rise to the other. But in both cases, both plants and animals, their major mode of propagation is to make egg and sperm, egg and pollen. And that's how the next generation arises, is via these specialized organs and cell types. And this means that the multicellular organism can then, during embryology, generate additional kinds of cells that are important for the main task of being an organism, which is to keep itself going. So animals develop muscles so they can move. Plants develop flowers. Well, that's a bad example because that's part of sex, but plants develop leaves so they can do photosynthesis, and bark so they can grow tall. And all of those adaptations are what we call somatic, and they are all inherently destined to die. They have a fixed lifetime. In some cases, in some insects, the soma only lasts for a day, although then there are lots of other instars and caterpillars and so on. But the basic idea is that the whole somatic program has the doom of death written on it, because it's not necessary from a evolutionary standpoint. What's necessary is to keep the lineage going. If it doesn't keep going, it goes extinct. And that job has been handed over to the germline. So the place you're wanting me to go, I think, is that for us humans, this has very important implications, obviously, because we are perhaps the only ones who understand that death is our fate. All other animals and plants do everything they can to avoid death, but the fact that it's going to happen anyway isn't part of their understanding of things. But it is our understanding of things from quite an early age, and it generates a lot of fear and anxiety and sorrow and everything. So there are two ways to look at that. One is to think about death as it relates to our emotional sorrow, anguish when loved ones die, be they our relatives, our friends, our animals. We are and completely should be distraught that they're no longer with us, they being part of our being and lifeline. But our own death, fearing it is one possibility. What I've come to think, in fact, I came to understand this when I was in college, is to my mind, it's going to be like before I was born. And before I was born, I'm not afraid of that. It was a time when, and so that took away a lot of the fear of what it would be like to be dead. But the other piece here is that in us, these other adaptations that multicellularity provides, including motility and so on, it also includes perception. It also includes brains. It also includes the way we think, the way we feel, the way we love. And so if we weren't multicellularity, if we weren't multicellular, we wouldn't have brains. And so there can be a hosanna for our multicellularity-ness because it allows us to have the lives and experience that we're privileged to have.
Yep, that was where I wanted you to go. Thank you. We're good.
And sacred depths.
Yeah. So I just think it's important because I can tell people all day long, hey, look, actually, a scientific understanding of nature does not have to be emotionally empty, right? But having concrete examples, I think, is very important. It gives people something to hook themselves to. Another piece of religions that I would like to talk about is the mythic aspect, right? We are organisms that like to tell stories and that like to make sense of things with stories. And you have identified and been one of the main proponents of something that we are sort of calling the evolutionary epic. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about what that means to you, or how the evolutionary epic is sort of bridging that gap between a scientific understanding of nature and what we're longing for as storytellers.
Okay, well, as we have come to understand nature via scientific inquiry, you're getting good at this. What we've discovered is that it's not the case that nature was created in 6 days, or in Genesis 2, it's there before the humans even show up, or however you want to read Genesis 2. But that it's been going on for at least 13 billion years. And of course, we have absolutely no way of grasping what 13 billion years is. We have no way of grasping what a billion years is. I don't think I even understand what 100,000 years is. But anyway, a long time. And during that time, a lot of things have been happening. And so for a minimalist version of a story is that it tells something in a sequence, that there's a beginning and a middle and an end, or a current time of it. And so as we've come to understand the natural world, we also understand that it has a history, including the evolutionary history of all of its creatures, and that this has a time frame. And so to say that one is embedded in the natural world or that one is embedded in this story, which I prefer to call everybody's story because it's everybody's story, is to sort of say the same thing. It's just making an emphasizing the time aspect of the natural world as opposed to some other things one might think about. And this time aspect then has given us the understanding, which is disquieting to some people, that we just showed up. Maybe 200,000 years ago for Homo sapiens, if you really push some of the fossil evidence, and that it's all been going on without us. We're new kids on the block, and that because presumably of our minds and our ability to have language and culture, we've kind of taken the place over and made a mess of it and need to fix our behavior. But it still is important, I think, to put that in the context of our late arrival. And another piece of that story, which you alluded to a few minutes ago, is that not only did we just show up, but we just showed up because we are totally inexorably interrelated with all the other creatures that came before us. So we have the same kinds of genes. We do everything the same kind of way. We are not special or different in any way, except that we happen to have these brains that can do fancy things. And that we've discovered, totally dependent on the rest of the natural world. We can't live without the rest of the natural world, even though some people feel that that's the case. They're absolutely wrong about that. And so this story has morals, and most stories we think about do have morals. There's a reason for telling the story. Maybe you just want to tell a joke, or maybe you want to make a point, or maybe you want to entertain, but a story usually has some take-homes, and the take-homes to everybody's story include very strong moral injunctions.
I am glad you ended there, because that is precisely what I wanted to ask about. Was you've been calling this everybody's story, and I think it's very important. It's obviously very challenging to try to unite an entire planet full of billions of people around an idea, and specifically one that is based on a scientific understanding of reality. But it is important, and you have said that you think it's important for people to have like some sort of religious emotion or some sort of regard for the world in order to be ethically motivated. And so there's a sense in which something like the evolutionary epic is necessary if we want to have some sort of sustainable, like a really sustaining care for each other in the world.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Oh.
I mean, great. Yeah.
And so this idea of the evolutionary epic, how do you've spent some time talking about it and promoting it, and do you find that people take to it like pretty easily? Right.
It depends completely. I mean, it's everything from yeah, sure to no way, right? And one thing that we haven't explicitly said, but which I think is very important to include, is that by adopting everybody's story, this doesn't mean that one's life doesn't have other stories, right? Mm. So if you only have one story, which happens to be true for me, one could say that's the easiest path because there's no conflict between stories. If you say, okay, evolution, everybody's story, I believe it, it's true, but I'm also a Christian. I also believe in the stories that come to me through biblical texts. That's harder to do. You have to work at that. You have to figure out where everybody's story leaves off for you and where the Christian story begins. So it's more of a challenge than just having one story. And of course, the final thing is that it's not a challenge if you just say, I am a Christian and I have the Christian story and I don't believe in any of this other stuff. I think the earth was created in 6 days, et cetera. Then you don't have a conflict either. So the people who are trying to do both are the ones who have the most work to do, although one could say that they also have a very rich life. This ability to carry two stories or several stories makes them arguably a richer and deeper person.
I would tend to agree with you that I think there is a very rich sophistication that can come from this, but it's also, I think, very either emotionally and or intellectually demanding, as you said. Like, there are definitely challenges inherent to that, and I think that involves taking a step back from your attachments to your religious beliefs being metaphysically true, and you have to almost turn them into something that is symbolic or that can, teach us moral lessons in some way, right? But it can't be something that is metaphysically true precisely because it does conflict with the scientific understanding of nature.
Yep. So, we haul out the good old trusty wild card metaphor.
Okay.
that the stories that come to us from our traditions that were written and thought of and experienced as revelation that preceded our current understandings of how the natural world works are not devoid of meaning or not devoid of interest or not are often tell us many things. The idea that we should love one another and be kind to the planet is hardly something that is absent from the text of most of the traditions, and obviously Native American ones in particular, or other indigenous ones. That kind of thing is front and center. But in the traditions, I think, without almost exception, and even the Native American ones that understand that humans came recently and that are just showed up and have to integrate themselves with the rest of their ecosystem, that even those stories, by definition, the human is center to the story. I mean, the human is telling the story. It's the story of the human as understood by the storyteller. And even the animals in indigenous traditions, they talk, they have language, they're doing things that we do. So we are putting our way of being in the world onto the rest of the world. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's important to recognize that that's what's happening and that that's what we're doing.
I think that's very
not call that metaphysics.
Right. I think that's very helpful, and the metaphors are not groundless then, because there is an analog in the natural world, and this is where the kinds of ideas that I prompted you to explain earlier about emergence and about death and consciousness, and there's so much, right? This is where those things can sort of come in and serve as the baseline for our crafting of the ways we make sense of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's
only one rule: you don't get to change nature.
Yeah, no, but that's true, right? And I think that actually brings us at a good point to start winding down on, which is if there is no changing nature, a theme that has to be really prominent is acceptance, right? If you have a religious story, you might tweak it, or you might be able to find somebody else who tells it a little bit differently. But with a scientific understanding of nature, it kind of is what it is unless you get new data, right?
Absolutely.
So you have, I think, two things, acceptance on one hand and an appreciation for mystery on the other, that sort of fill in the rest of the gaps that might be left by this understanding of.
So I prefer the word assent to acceptance, because acceptance can kind of mean, oh, well, all right, I guess I have no choice. Whereas assent is a positive attitude that says, okay, who am I to say that nature should be different? Who am I to say that there shouldn't be a volcano? It's not just that I accept that there are volcanoes. I give assent to volcanoes because they're in fact arise because we have plate tectonics and the plates are shifting and hot stuff from the inside of the earth spews out. And that's what it is. And nature isn't evil because nature generates volcanoes, which is, I mean, there are all sorts of ways you can go with that.
Right. And that's, I think, that's a very beautiful distinction there between the words of accept and assent. And then you talk a lot also about the idea of mystery, right? Mm-hmm. Where we actually run up against not knowing, where science runs up, where the act of science runs up against not knowing, then we can sort of, instead of being terrified of the uncertainty and running away from it, which I think is a very natural and understandable response, you can sort of turn towards it and appreciate it as something that's wondrous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it'd be very boring to live in a situation where there was no mystery. And as I say in my book and elsewhere, the big one is, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? The famous philosopher's trope. But we don't know that. It could be that there was nothing, and instead there's something, and we don't know why. And for the believer would like to say it's because God did it. And then, of course, you get to the, well, why is there God and all of that stuff, which I find very boring. So for me, I'm just really happy to live in a place where there is mystery and where there are things that we don't know the answers to. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that you find God in the gaps, or at least I think that's an unfortunate move. I think that the problem with that is that God keeps getting smaller and smaller as gaps keep getting filled, and you no longer need God to explain X or Y, and pretty soon God becomes very deistic and kind of, got the thing started and then stepped back and wasn't interested, which isn't why people are looking for a God at all. The deistic God is useless. So to my mind, you might as well just not have one at all. And so having mystery means not knowing answers, but living in what you do know is what I think is much richer.
Mm. Yeah, there's a sense in which there are things that we think would be really good for us, but maybe they wouldn't, right?
Like, what would you say?
Such as having all the answers, right? Or
yeah, okay.
Such as like Don Crosby is often talks about, and he actually was on the podcast twice. He talks about how the idea of heaven is probably something that we wouldn't altogether like, right?
It'd be boring,
right? Because it's boring.
Yeah.
And we need to. It's very helpful if we know this, because then we can actually embrace things that are honest if they scare us. Yep. Okay, so we're coming up on an hour. I'm wondering if you have. Okay. I know the time goes by so quick.
So yeah, there is a plug.
I love plugs.
I don't like doing this, but I'm making myself do it. And that is that if any of your listeners are interested in any of this, it turns out that about 5 years ago, a bunch of us put up a website and set up a nonprofit organization. It's called the Religious Naturalist Association. And if you just put those 3 words into Google, you will get the URL, which is the same thing with hyphens in the middle of it, and .org. And we there put up a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about, and there is an option to become a member for free for anybody who feels like they'd like to join in. And the idea, which presumably should be obvious for people who've listened to this whole podcast, is not that there is a version of this orientation that we're promoting at all. It's rather to have a home so that people know that there are others like them out there and can get ideas from. And we have listservs and all of the usual bells and whistles. What's fun is that although we haven't advertised, we don't have any money. There are already over 500 members from 20 different countries, including lots from England. And the people who, when they offer to give a reason why they're joining, which we offer them as an option, often say, "Oh, I'm so excited in my town. There's nobody who thinks like me, and I didn't think anybody did. And now I know I'm part of a community, and that feels really cool to me." So there it is, my plug. My evangelism. I don't know whether you've had a chance to go to the site. And a lot of the people who are supporting the site are people that you've had on your podcast, like Michael Hogue and Don Crosby. They're all advisors to this and all supporting it.
Yeah, I've been familiar with it for ages. I don't think I'm officially a member. I went to the IRIS, the Institute for.
Yeah. Well, that's really different.
It's a very different world. Yes. But no, this association is full of really brilliant people and great resources. Even just going to the website and learning about all of the books, that have been written by the advisory board and everything. Like it's really extraordinary, and it's a phenomenal resource. So I will actually, I'll talk about the organization and association and put links on social media and all that sort of thing.
That would be terrific. And I hope you join yourself if you haven't done so.
Yeah, in like 2 minutes, like right now. Yeah, it's important. We're just trying to.
Yeah, it's just
stuff here.
I don't know whether we'll ever do anything, but it's just the existence is for me very, very healing. When I'm feeling frustrated, I say, "Oh, wait a minute, there are all these other people out there."
Good.
And who knows what will be? Okay. All right. Well, it's been great to talk to you, and have a great rest of the week.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. As I have said a million times, I'm really quite honored to meet you, and I will be spending a lot of time in the coming years trying to promote your stuff. So thank you.
And send me your chapter.
Okay.
Bye. I'm going to press delete.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Ursula.
Bye.
Okay, bye.